Good day, and welcome to AI Podcast at digitVIEW. Whether you're a business leader, technologist, or simply curious about what's next, we explore how artificial intelligence is transforming the way we work, create, and make decisions.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to tackle a question that's, it's pretty unsettling. It's about power, psychology, and survival. And it's a pattern we've seen again and again throughout history, which makes understanding it right now more critical than ever. All right, so let's get right into it. This question, wow, it really gets to the heart of some of the darkest moments in history, doesn't it? It points to a really dangerous psychological truth about leadership and power. And to figure out the answer, we have to look way deeper than the surface. Okay, so first things first. To really get this, we've got to throw out our usual ideas of winner and loser. Forget about them as just labels or personality traits. The source material here is really pushing us to think about them as two completely different operating systems for how a person processes the world. And here's the key thing to grasp. This isn't about being rich or powerful at one single moment in time. It's all about a dynamic feedback loop. It's about how someone's brain responds to new information over and over again, especially when that information challenges what they believe to be true. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Look at how this breaks down into two opposing systems. On one side, you've got what's called the winner pattern. That's all about adapting, learning, and aligning with reality as it actually is. And on the other side, you've got the loser pattern, which does the exact opposite. It actively twists and distorts reality to protect the person's ego. So let's dig a little deeper, right? Let's look at the mechanics of these two patterns. What do these feedback loops actually look like in the real world? So the winner pattern, and this is important, it's not about winning every single time or being happy 24/7, not at all. It's about having psychological stability. It's the ability to hear you're wrong, to take in that new data, and to adapt. For them, failure is just information. It's not a personal catastrophe. But then you have the loser pattern. And it is a completely different story. It's built on a foundation of extreme fragility. I mean, their self-worth is so brittle that any kind of loss feels like a threat to their very existence. So what happens? The brain's defense mechanisms go into overdrive. It rewrites the facts, it blames everyone else, and it has to constantly perform success just to keep from shattering. And this quote right here, this absolutely nails it. We're not talking about just losing a single vote or a battle or a business deal. We're talking about a psychological structure that is literally incapable of processing failure without completely breaking down. So what happens when you give someone with this kind of incredibly fragile mindset immense, unbelievable, world-changing power? Well, this is where things get really, really dangerous. You see, for a leader operating on this pattern, losing an election or a war isn't just a political setback. Their brain, their actual primitive wiring, interprets it as a threat to their survival, an identity death. And that triggers the most basic survival instincts we have: aggression, deep denial. It turns a political contest into a fight to the death. And what's kind of crazy is that this tends to play out in a scarily predictable four-step pattern. First, a charismatic leader rises to power. Second, they face a major challenge or a failure they can't ignore. Third, this pushes them to a psychological breaking point. And at that point, they have a choice: adapt to reality or escalate against it. The loser pattern, by its very nature, always chooses escalation. And man, if you look back at history, it's just littered with grim examples. Think about Napoleon. His ego, his myth of being invincible, just couldn't accept the reality of the Russian winter. And it cost him almost his entire army. Or Stalin, who, instead of admitting his economic policies were failing, just invented enemies everywhere and purged his own people. It was a massive reality distortion project. And of course, Hitler in his bunker, totally detached from the facts, choosing to burn Germany to the ground rather than admit he had lost. So you see what's happening, right? The entire system, a whole country, an entire civilization sometimes, it becomes a hostage. It's held captive by one person's psychological need to avoid the pain of admitting they were wrong. The system has to be destroyed before their identity is. Okay, so this is an old pattern, but now a powerful new player is entering the game. A real wild card: artificial intelligence. And this could change everything. And AI isn't just another gadget. Think of it like a massive force multiplier. It could either help us finally break this destructive cycle by holding power accountable to facts, or it could supercharge it into something we've never even imagined.
I mean, just look at the two forks in the road here. On one hand, you could have AI as a kind of reality anchor, right? A tool that fact-checks claims in real time and holds everyone accountable to data. But then there's the other path. AI as the ultimate propaganda amplifier, creating hyper-personalized echo chambers that just reinforce a leader's delusions and spread them to millions in a heartbeat. And all of this, it leads us to the final point. And honestly, this might be the toughest pill to swallow. The focus can't just be on the leaders themselves. We have to look at us.
So let's just make sure we've got this new definition locked in. A true winner isn't someone who never loses. It's someone who can lose, who can learn from it, and who can adapt. A loser, in this psychological sense, is someone whose identity is so fragile they cannot lose without distorting reality. And this is the real gut punch. The problem isn't just that people with these fragile egos exist. They're always going to be around. The real danger, the real problem, is that our systems, our political systems, our media, even our corporate systems, they often select for and reward the exact traits of the loser pattern. The performative greatness, the refusal to ever back down, the constant creation of enemies. And so that leaves us with this huge and pretty urgent question, doesn't it? It's not enough to just spot this pattern in other people. We have to look at the system itself. If our systems are accidentally rewarding the most fragile people with the most power, how do we fix the system? That's the real challenge ahead of us.
Why would a leader willingly destroy their own empire or their own company rather than simply admit they made a mistake?
Right. It sounds completely irrational on the surface.
Totally. I mean, but if you look closely at the mechanics of history, and this is according to a massive new artificial intelligence analysis we're digging into today, it's actually not a personality flaw at all.
Yeah, it's so much deeper than that.
It is a predictable, hardwired evolutionary glitch, and when it gets triggered in the wrong person at the wrong time, it can literally bring down the entire system.
It really shifts how you view the world, honestly, because we tend to write these catastrophic leadership failures off as, just extreme stubbornness or a massive ego trip.
Exactly, just a bad boss.
Right. But this analysis treats the human mind under pressure like a structural engineering problem. When the load-bearing walls of a leader's ego face too much reality, they don't just bend, they snap in very specific, measurable ways.
And to get into the actual mechanics of how that snapping happens, we're pulling from some wildly interesting source material today. It comes from a breakdown over at digitVIEW.
Yeah, driven by that AI system, right? RSRHAI.
Yes, RASRHAI, which is essentially this massive pattern generator. Instead of reading history as a boring timeline of random isolated dates and battles, this AI scans centuries of data.
Connecting the dots between psychology, economics, collapse.
Exactly. It's looking for these recursive loops in human behavior.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to make sense of anything RESRH AI is claiming, we really need to throw out our playground definitions of winning and losing.
We do, because the AI is looking at the raw code of human decision-making.
Right.
And its core focus is redefining what we actually mean by winners and losers.
Right.
The system argues that our everyday definitions of those words are just completely useless for understanding actual power.
We are so conditioned to think of a winner as a static identity. You hold up the trophy, you have the most money, you won the election, therefore, boom, you are a winner.
Yeah, but this analysis argues that winner and loser are not states of being at all. They are dynamic feedback loops.
Okay, so break that down for me. What does the winner loop actually look like?
Well, it's not about the snapshot of who crossed the finish line first. It's about how a human brain processes uncomfortable reality over an extended period of time. So, the AI defines the winner pattern fundamentally by adaptation.
Adaptation.
Right. A winner, in this systems level view, is an individual who successfully divorces their core underlying identity from the outcome of a specific event.
Oh, wait. So it's the difference between saying, I failed at this project versus I am a failure.
That is the precise mechanical difference, yes.
Wow.
Because they separate those two things, they can accept negative feedback without experiencing this massive psychological trauma. They have what the research calls a controlled ego.
A controlled ego. That makes sense.
Yeah, to a mind operating in the winner pattern, failure doesn't hurt. It's just data. It's raw information telling them to, update their belief system and adjust their strategy.
I gotta push back on this a bit, though, because if a leader is constantly taking in negative data admitting fault and like pivoting their strategy all the time, wouldn't they look incredibly weak to their followers?
That's a really common assumption, yeah.
I mean, we are culturally wired to follow unwavering confidence. How does a leader maintain authority if their defining trait is essentially saying, oops, my bad, let's try something else?
Well, that is the paradox of modern leadership, and the AI actually addresses it. The most sustainable authority actually comes from trust, not infallibility.
Right, because you trust they'll fix the problem.
Exactly. When a leader pivots based on data, it signals to the system that reality matters more than their personal pride. However, you are absolutely right that this winner pattern isn't flawless. The source text points out a very dangerous trap that highly adaptive leaders often fall into.
Oh, the arrogance of early success.
Yes. Because they're so good at adapting early on, they start winning.
And winning feels good.
It triggers dopamine. Over years, that constant chemical reward from success physically rewires the brain.
Yeah.
It makes them start ignoring constraints.
They get this sort of moral blind spot, right?
Yeah, they begin to subconsciously believe, I win, therefore my intuition is flawless. So the adaptation stops, they detach from empathy, and they stop listening to dissenting voices because they just feel they've outgrown the need for feedback.
Which is the perfect bridge to the other side of this framework, the loser pattern.
Right.
If the winner pattern is about reality alignment, the loser pattern is characterized by absolute reality distortion. And this is where the AI's definition gets really sharp.
It does.
To a person operating in this pattern, a loss isn't just a temporary setback, it's not bad data, it is a literal existential threat.
Because their entire psychological architecture is built on being perceived as infallible. They possess immense identity fragility.
Identity fragility, that's a great term.
What's fascinating here is that when a failure inevitably happens, their brain treats it like literal death. It just cannot integrate the concept of I lost into their internal narrative.
So how do they cope? I mean, if you literally can't process reality, what does your brain do with it?
It builds elaborate external blame systems. They rely entirely on performative greatness. When the numbers go down or, the battle is lost, it is never their strategy.
It's always someone else's fault.
Always. It's a rigged system, it's an enemy conspiracy, or it's a profound betrayal from their own advisors. They will burn the people around them just to keep their own identity intact.
Wow.
Yeah, a loser, according to this AI, isn't someone who loses a game. It is someone who fundamentally lacks the psychological capacity to handle loss without breaking.
Okay, let's pause and just think about the mechanics of that. Think about a time in your own life, maybe at work, where you made a massive, undeniable mistake.
Oh, I know that feeling.
Right. You feel your stomach drop, your heart starts racing, you might even start sweating. That physical reaction is intense for just like a missed deadline. Why does our biology react to failure with such overwhelming panic?
It's primal.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The source traces this back to an evolutionary glitch.
Yeah, we have to remember that for hundreds of thousands of years of human development, status in your tribe was not a luxury. It was your only survival mechanism.
If you lost status, you didn't just feel embarrassed.
No, you lost your share of the food, you lost access to mates, you lost the physical protection of the group against predators.
Basically, social extinction was a direct precursor to physical extinction. If you were cast out, you died.
Right, so the human brain evolved to defend status with the exact same biological intensity that it uses to defend against a physical attack.
Cortisol floods the system.
The amygdala fires up, and higher-order analytical thinking just shuts down to prioritize immediate self-preservation. So we are navigating a modern world with instantaneous global markets and AI and nuclear arsenals, but the software running the show is still that primitive, status-obsessed tribal brain.
We basically have Stone Age hardware trying to run world-ending technology.
Exactly.
And the AI maps this biological glitch onto a predictable four-phase historical arc of leadership collapse. It's not just a theory, it is a sequence you can track. Let's look at how this actually plays out in reality. Walk me through the phases.
Well, the cycle almost always begins with phase one, the rise. You get a highly charismatic leader who builds this massive base of support.
Right.
And they do this by projecting a narrative of absolute strength. They are the ultimate winner who promises to solve, all complex problems with simple, forceful dominance.
But the real test of a leader never happens during the rise. Everything is easy then. The true diagnostic happens in phase two, which is the challenge or failure.
Right. The invulnerability narrative hits a wall.
Exactly. Maybe it's a severe economic downturn, a pandemic, or a military campaign that bogs down. The undeniable reality on the ground just no longer matches the leader's promises.
Which forces phase 3, psychological breakpoint. The leader is staring at the raw data of failure. This is the moment of choice.
The fork in the road.
Yeah, they can engage the winner pattern, take the hit to their ego, admit the miscalculation, and change course. Or if their identity is too fragile, they choose the loser path.
And when a person holding incredible power makes that second choice, we hit phase 4, dangerous escalation. Because they cannot absorb the reality of the failure, they basically decide to wage war on reality itself.
Yes.
They will actively expand a conflict, suppress the truth, and destroy their own institutions just to avoid admitting they were wrong.
The source text really highlights the psychological tension here, bringing up the concept of cognitive dissonance. The leader holds two conflicting truths at the same time. I am an infallible savior, and my current strategy is an absolute disaster.
The analogy that came to my mind while reading this is like a computer encountering a fatal paradox. When a traditional operating system hits an error it can't resolve, it just blue screens.
Right, it crashes.
It crashes and shuts down entirely to prevent hardware damage, but the human ego refuses to crash. Instead of shutting down, the mind furiously starts rewriting its own operating code in real time just to keep the system running.
Oh, that is a phenomenal way to visualize it. If the data says you're losing, the ego decides the data must be a conspiracy.
Exactly. It deploys propaganda to rewrite the external world. It isolates the leader from anyone holding conflicting data, creating this massive echo chamber.
Yeah.
And what's truly haunting about the AI's analysis is the assertion that these leaders often know they are failing on a subconscious level, but bringing that knowledge into conscious thought would cause total identity collapse. So they just keep doubling down.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, let's take this out of the realm of theory for a second and look at the actual historical data RESRH AI processed.
Let's do it.
This specific psychological sequence repeats across centuries with chilling accuracy. Take Napoleon Bonaparte as a prime example of the danger of early adaptation turning into arrogance.
I mean, he had an incredible string of early victories.
He did. The campaigns in Italy, Austerlitz, he was a master of the winner pattern early on. He adapted brilliantly on the battlefield. But that sustained dopamine loop of success warped his risk assessment.
The brain chemistry shifted.
Right. So by the time he planned the invasion of Russia, his identity was completely consumed by the myth of his own invincibility. He ignored the profound logistical constraints of a Russian winter because his brain could literally no longer process the idea that a system could defeat him.
Wow. Then you have someone like Joseph Stalin, which the text uses to illustrate the mechanics of paranoia and that external blame system. When Stalin's agricultural policies caused massive, undeniable famine, or when his industrial targets failed, he didn't adjust the policies.
No, because adjusting the policy would mean admitting a flaw in his leadership.
Yeah.
Instead, he engaged the ultimate reality distortion field, the purges. He built a system where the punishment for delivering bad news was execution or the gulag. He systematically eliminated anyone competent enough to hold him accountable.
Effectively insulating his fragile ego in a bubble of absolute terror.
Exactly.
And perhaps the most extreme example of the blue screen rewrite is Adolf Hitler at the end of World War II.
A textbook case.
When the military reality was mathematically unresolvable with Allied forces closing in on all sides, he didn't just refuse to surrender. He sat in a bunker, moving imaginary divisions around a map, issuing orders to armies that literally no longer existed.
Yeah.
He chose the literal destruction of his entire country over the psychological collapse of admitting defeat.
The synthesis of these historical data points is incredibly stark. When a leader's psychological need to be a winner outweighs their grip on reality, their internal fragility becomes a system-wide explosive device.
So we know this is a deeply entrenched biological human pattern, but the source material from digitVIEW isn't just looking backward, right? It's heavily focused on the modern variable.
Right, technology.
How does artificial intelligence change this ancient loop? Technology is a multiplier, and the source outlines a very distinct dual nature of AI in this context.
Yeah, like any powerful tool, AI can act as a stabilizing force, or it can be an unprecedented accelerant for disaster. On the positive side, AI's defining strength is pattern recognition at scale.
Which is exactly what RSRH AI is doing.
Exactly. A sophisticated system can monitor vast dataset shifts in a leader's rhetoric, economic indicators, diplomatic cables, and detect the early behavioral markers of that Phase 3 breakpoint.
Oh, so it can see the ego starting to crack before the leader even realizes it's happening.
Precisely. It strips away the emotion. The text described AI's potential as a reality anchor.
That concept really stuck with me. Think of an airplane pilot flying through a massive storm. They can suffer from spatial disorientation where their inner ear completely tricks them into feeling like the plane is flying straight.
But in reality, they're in a steep nosedive.
Right. The AI reality anchor is the altimeter on the dashboard. It doesn't care about the pilot's feelings or intuition. It just coldly points to the objective truth. You are going down. Pull up.
But the danger arises when the pilot decides to smash the altimeter.
Oh, that's dark.
And that brings us to the dark side of the AI equation. If a leader, already gripped by the loser pattern, gains control of these advanced algorithmic systems, the consequences are terrifying. AI can be weaponized to automate the reality distortion field.
It becomes a propaganda engine on steroids. Instead of just surrounding themselves with a few yes men, a fragile leader can use AI to generate highly personalized, impenetrable echo chambers for millions of citizens simultaneously.
They can literally synthesize an alternate reality to protect their ego.
Which means the stakes for recognizing these psychological patterns have never been higher in human history. The margin for error is shrinking rapidly. So what does this all mean? We've diagnosed this evolutionary glitch, we've seen how it destroyed historical empires, and we understand how modern tech can amplify it.
Right.
The RESRH AI analysis doesn't just leave us with this bleak picture, thankfully. It actually proposes a highly specific 5-step framework to rewire human systems to survive this.
It's basically an intervention plan for humanity. And step 1 requires going all the way back to early childhood development. We have to normalize loss early.
Which makes sense because our current education and cultural systems do the exact opposite.
They really do.
We treat grades and athletic wins as a measure of a child's intrinsic worth. We inadvertently teach them that failing makes them a failure. How do we practically change that?
It requires a massive shift in how we praise and evaluate. We have to decouple self-worth from outcomes and heavily reward the process of adaptation. We need to teach children that a failure is just a data point.
A mechanical error to be debugged.
Yes, not a permanent stain on their identity.
But what about the leaders we already have? That brings us to step 2, building robust feedback systems. We cannot allow powerful individuals to operate in silos.
Right. In corporate or political structures, the people delivering the data must be institutionally insulated from the leader's wrath. If a CEO or a president can simply fire the person who brings them bad news, the feedback loop is broken. The truth tellers need structural protection.
Which leads to step 3, and I really struggled with the logistics of this one, honestly. The AI suggests mandatory psychological screening for power roles.
Measuring candidates for ego rigidity and identity fragility before handing them power.
Right, but how on earth do you practically implement that? Who designs the test? If you tell a politician they have to pass a psych evaluation before they get the nuclear codes or control of the treasury, wouldn't the test itself become heavily politicized and biased?
That is the enormous hurdle. The implementation is fraught with bias. But the AI's counterargument is, look at the alternative.
Fair point.
We currently hand over global economic levers and military might based purely on who is the most charismatic on television. The system argues that we need objective metrics for measuring how a candidate reacts to unexpected failure in simulated environments.
Kind of like how we test pilots in simulators before they fly real passengers.
Exactly like that.
Okay, step 4 integrates the technology we talked about, deploying AI as a permanent reality mirror.
This would be an independent, continuous diagnostic running in the background of a government or a corporation. It constantly measures a leader's claimed successes against the undeniable objective outcomes.
So if a leader claims a policy is working brilliantly, the reality mirror publicly publishes the raw, contextualized data without spin.
It's forcing the altimeter to be visible to the passengers, not just the pilot.
I love that. And finally, step 5 is the broadest and arguably the most difficult, a massive cultural shift in how we define winning. We have to move away from the idea that winning equals dominance and transition to winning equals adaptation and truth alignment.
It is an incredibly difficult shift because the human brain loves the simplicity of dominance. This raises an important question, actually, which is the AI's closing thought. History is essentially a recursive loop of human psychology buckling under pressure.
Yeah.
It loops because our primitive hardware keeps making the same errors when our status is threatened.
And our modern attention economy thrives on this. We give our clicks, our money, and our votes to the loudest, most boastful voices. We actively reward performative greatness. The source text drops this one line that really summarizes the whole problem. The real danger is not that losers exist. It's that our systems actively reward people who cannot handle losing.
Exactly. So the ultimate purpose of artificial intelligence shouldn't just be optimizing supply chains or generating text. Its highest purpose could be acting as a circuit breaker for that historical loop.
Helping humanity spot the markers of fragility earlier.
Right. Forcing us to process reality faster and preventing the catastrophic escalations that inevitably follow when powerful egos refuse to break.
There is so much to digest here, but to distill this entire deep dive down for you listening right now, winners and losers have absolutely nothing to do with the scoreboard. It is entirely about who has the psychological resilience to look at an uncomfortable reality in the face, accept the data, and adapt without their internal identity shattering to pieces.
It's the core of it.
Because when the people steering our institutions lack that basic resilience, their private internal fragility becomes a global threat. But I want to leave you with something highly practical to think about today. We spent this conversation looking at massive historical figures, emperors, dictators, global systems.
The big stuff.
Right. But this exact same evolutionary glitch is operating in the microsystems of your own life right now. Look closely at the dynamics at your workplace. Look at the local leaders in your community, or even the influencers and algorithms you interact with on your phone every day. If history truly is a recursive loop that rewards those who cannot handle losing, what behaviors are you personally rewarding?
It's a great question.
Are you elevating people who admit when they are wrong and pivot based on data? Or are you drawn to the loud, performative confidence of people who blame everyone else when things go south? The next time someone in your circle refuses to admit an obvious mistake, pay close attention. Ask yourself, are you just watching a momentary lapse in judgment, or are you witnessing the quiet beginning of a very dangerous loop?
Welcome to the arena, where progress is forged in the fire of healthy debate.
Together, we dismantle the complex issues shaping our society.
Welcome to the debate. You know, if an engineer looks at a steel bridge, structural vulnerability is highly quantifiable. You measure the load-bearing capacity, you identify the microfractures, and you can calculate precisely when and how a collapse will occur.
Right, it's just objective physics at that point.
Exactly, it's objective. But when we look at human civilization armed with global economies, interconnected supply chains, and, nuclear weapons, our collapse isn't a matter of physics, it's a matter of psychology.
Yeah, which is significantly harder to measure.
Right. So today we are asking a pretty terrifying question. Are we structurally vulnerable? Are we doomed by the fragile egos of leaders who just refuse to lose? And on the flip side, can artificial intelligence actually serve as an objective safeguard against our own psychology?
That is honestly the ultimate diagnostic blind spot, isn't it? Because we are dealing with a landscape that isn't mathematical. It's, we are exploring this crazy intersection of behavioral psychology, historical crisis cycles, and AI.
Yeah, drawing heavily from the new Res-HI framework.
Exactly. And for those who might be unfamiliar, this isn't just some fringe theory. It is a massive predictive model that has digested thousands of historical power transitions to map out the psychological patterns of quote-unquote winners and losers in leadership roles, and how those patterns impact global stability.
And the central tension we're unpacking today is where that true structural vulnerability actually lies. So briefly, my position is that the core threat is the individual leader's ego rigidity and cognitive dissonance, and that AI pattern recognition can objectively measure and mitigate this by acting as a sort of reality mirror.
Right, and I read the exact same framework, but my position is that the true danger lies in systemic structures that actively reward performative greatness. I argue that inserting AI into those dynamics risks, amplifying propaganda rather than curing human delusion.
Okay, so before we go further, I feel like we need to be really careful with the word loser here.
Yeah, definitely. We're not talking about sports.
No, exactly. We aren't talking about a CEO who misses a quarterly target or a politician who gracefully concedes an election. From the viewpoint of the behavioral psychology and crisis management experts who fed this framework, we are talking about a very specific, highly destructive psychological pattern.
A structural inability to cope, really.
Yes, a loser in this context is defined by an inability to integrate loss into their identity without psychologically breaking.
Which, when you look at it, is just a fundamental evolutionary mismatch.
Precisely. I mean, evolution wired the human brain to equate losing with social extinction. Think about it. 10,000 years ago, a total collapse of status meant you were cast out of the tribe.
Right, which essentially meant you died.
Exactly. You starved or got eaten. So to the primitive brain, losing an election or admitting a catastrophic policy failure feels literally indistinguishable from physical death. Primitive survival mechanisms just completely take over.
And that triggers the dangerous reality distortion and destructive escalation we see in these leaders.
Exactly.
But, this is where I start to diverge from your focus on the individual ego. Yes, that primitive wiring exists in all of us. But why do we hand the launch codes to people with that specific fragile wiring?
Well, they seek out power.
They do, but identity fragility doesn't survive in a vacuum. It requires an ecosystem of enablers. If you look at how voters assess modern political leadership or how corporate boards select executives, we actively seek out absolute certainty. We have built global systems that fundamentally confuse dominance with success.
But the system only exerts pressure. Think of the individual leader's ego like a pressurized submarine hull. As long as they're, winning and projecting that dominance you mentioned, the pressure is equalized.
Okay, I follow that.
But the moment an objective failure introduces outside pressure, a fragile identity doesn't just spring a leak. The entire hull implodes to protect the vacuum inside, because they literally cannot rewrite their identity to accommodate the loss.
Wait, so what happens to the failure in their mind then? Like, how do they process the reality of the loss if they can't accept it?
They don't. They rewrite reality itself. They build this massive distortion field. They use isolation, they suppress dissent, and they enforce loyalty systems entirely based on fear.
So the failure is never their fault?
Never. It is always attributed to external enemies, to systemic betrayal, to, deep state conspiracies. It is a deeply individual psychological failure to process reality. And that internal distortion is what ultimately fractures the structural integrity of the civilization around them.
I mean, that submarine metaphor explains the internal mechanics beautifully, but it completely ignores the ocean crushing down on the hull. The environment surrounding the leader is precisely what allows that reality distortion field to take hold.
How so? The leader is the one building the field.
Because the systemic rewards for performative greatness mean that leaders are rarely incentivized to practice reality acceptance. Like, think about modern political systems. If the leader admits they were wrong, the system, the media, the opposition, the shareholders, they destroy them. They're punished for honesty.
I mean, I think that's a pretty cynical view of the system, though. If the system is entirely to blame, how do we explain leaders who do successfully pivot?
What do you mean?
Well, take a CEO who launches a flagship product that just completely fails in the market. Instead of doubling down, or blaming the consumers, or firing their analytics team, they accept the failure as data. They separate their identity from the outcome, they take the financial hit, and they pivot the company. Doesn't this prove that individual reality acceptance is the key variable?
Not necessarily. The existence of a healthy pivot doesn't absolve the brutal system they operate within. You're assuming the winner pattern, which is, adaptation, feedback, acceptance, truth alignment, is inherently immune to systemic corruption.
Well, they're definitely more resilient than the loser pattern.
Sure, early on. But those winners have their own dangerous psychological patterns that these exact same systems enable. Successful leaders who have achieved great things often develop severe moral blind spots over time.
Wait, how so? If they adapt to reality, aren't they avoiding the crisis?
Only temporarily. The internal logic of a winner slowly becomes, I win, therefore I am right. And that breeds a complete detachment from empathy. It creates an arrogance that ignores dissent. Early success breeds later instability because the system rewards that early adaptation with unchecked power. The system removes the guardrails, which means the adaptable winner eventually faces a crisis where their ego has grown too large for reality anyway. The individual might pull the trigger, but the system loaded the gun by prioritizing ego protection and dominance over actual societal safety from day one.
Okay, but let's look at what history actually shows us, especially for historians analyzing failed empires and their leadership crisis cycles. The ultimate catastrophic collapses always come from the individual refusal to adapt to constraints.
I'm not denying the collapses happen.
Right. But the RESRHA framework frames history not as a static timeline, but as a pattern generator. There is this distinct four-phase historical abstraction we see repeated across centuries: rise, challenge, psychological breakpoint, and escalation.
Let's focus on that third phase, the breakpoint, because I think that's where the core of our debate really lives.
Exactly. Because that's the ego trap. Look at Napoleon Bonaparte's Russian campaign. The failure wasn't just the winter weather.
Obviously not.
The failure was the psychological breakpoint. Napoleon was presented with empirical data. Supply lines were overextended, troops were starving, the Russian army was refusing decisive engagement. A healthy leader accepts the constraint, admits the initial strategy failed, and turns back.
But his identity wouldn't let him.
Right. His identity was built on an aura of invincibility. To retreat was to accept the identity of a loser. So to resolve the cognitive dissonance, he overrode survival instincts and escalated the campaign, essentially destroying his own army to protect his ego. That is empirical proof of individual overconfidence causing structural collapse.
The historical phases lined up, sure. I agree with the Napoleon example. But just looking at the timeline is treating the symptom. We really need to look at the evolutionary root here. Why do populations march into the snow with a leader who is clearly experiencing severe cognitive dissonance?
Because the leader has purged anyone who points out the snow.
Yeah, but that happens late in the game. In phase one, the rise, the populations continuously fall for those initial narratives of strength.
Well, people want to feel safe.
Exactly. The terrifying reality is that we are operating nuclear arsenals with the exact same brain wiring that panicked when it got kicked out of a hunter-gatherer tribe. We are evolutionarily wired to follow performative greatness and to seek out leaders who project absolute certainty.
Even when it's a complete delusion.
Yes. Voters assessing modern political leadership routinely punish nuanced, adaptable thinkers who say, the data's unclear, we might need to change course. They punish them. Instead, they reward the table-pounding strongman who claims only they can fix it. The individual despot is just the symptom. Our collective susceptibility to dominance is the underlying structural flaw.
Okay, I hear that. While the collective might have an evolutionary predisposition to follow strong narratives initially, the existential threat only really materializes when the individual at the top reaches that phase 3 breakpoint and chooses denial.
You don't think the population pushes them there?
No, the populations don't orchestrate the late-stage escalation. The fragile ego of the leader does, and this brings us precisely to why artificial intelligence offers a profound structural solution. It attacks the vulnerability where human psychology is totally blind.
Now, if you are listening to this, you might be highly skeptical that an algorithm can fix a Napoleon complex. How exactly does an AI prevent a modern dictator from marching into a metaphorical Russia?
By fundamentally changing the historical loop. The framework introduces the concept of AI as a reality mirror. And let's explain how this actually operates, because it's not just like a dashboard on a president's desk.
Right, it's systemic.
Yes, AI thrives on pattern recognition. It can continuously measure ego rigidity in real time. It uses natural language processing to analyze a leader's speeches, internal communications, directives, and it maps them against empirical outcomes.
So wait, it's basically a real-time lie detector?
It is much, much deeper than that. It detects the divergence between promised outcomes and reality. When that gap widens and the leader's language becomes more absolute, isolated, and paranoid, the AI flags the loser pattern emerging.
Okay, but a flag doesn't stop a war.
It acts as an administrative escrow. Before a leader can authorize a massive resource diversion, say a military mobilization or some disastrous economic policy, the AI acts as a mandatory checkpoint. If it detects a high probability of reality distortion, it automatically triggers a mandatory review by an independent civilian board or even freezes the administrative levers.
Oh, let's pause there. because that assumes the AI has authority over the people with the guns. I have a major problem with this structural analysis.
Why?
It anchors the system in reality. Fear-based loyalty enforcement. They have surrounded themselves with sycophants. An AI reality mirror, no matter how objective its data is just another dissident to be purged. How can an objective AI survive a system actively built to protect a fragile ego? They will simply unplug it.
But they can't, because the AI isn't a political opponent that can be intimidated, exiled, or easily unplugged. We are talking about deep architectural integration into administrative, economic, and military feedback systems.
Systems that authoritarians control.
Not all of them. These would be independent data channels operating outside a single leader's direct control. A president can't just unplug the global financial market. The reality mirror provides an anchored truth that creates systemic friction against the leader's cognitive dissonance.
You are treating AI as if it exists in this pure mathematical vacuum, immune to human influence. AI thrives on pattern recognition, absolutely. But what happens to pattern recognition when the training data is actively poisoned?
The AI is cross-referencing against global baselines.
But an authoritarian regime controls its internal baselines. If a systemic structure equates losing with an existential threat, it will absolutely ensure the AI's data reflects its delusions. You are talking about measuring empirical outcomes. Who defines the empirical outcome in a closed state?
Well, objective resource metrics.
They will fake the metrics. Instead of a reality mirror, the AI becomes a propaganda engine. It will amplify the leader's external blame systems. It will generate highly persuasive algorithmic justifications for why the failure was actually a conspiracy by foreign enemies. It gives the illusion of mathematical objectivity to a deeply flawed ego defense. It accelerates the collapse.
I think that assumes the AI is entirely isolated within the authoritarian structure, which modern AI is not. Even closed states interact with global supply chains. An internal regime might try to feed the AI propaganda, sure.
They definitely will.
But the AI is constantly validating against global economic indicators, international trade sentiments, satellite imagery. The cognitive dissonance of the leader is immediately flagged because the AI detects the friction between the regime's internal narrative and global reality.
Okay, but even if the AI detects the friction, who acts on it? If the global systems prioritize ego protection over actual societal safety, the AI's warning is completely useless.
Which is why the framework doesn't suggest AI works in isolation as some sort of silver bullet. The solution outlined is twofold. Yes, we need independent AI data channels to measure real-time ego rigidity, but we combine that with normalizing loss early co-education.
Education?
Yes, we have to rewire how populations process failure from the ground up. We teach children that failure is simply data. Identity does not equal outcome. If you separate identity from the outcome, losing an election or failing a policy isn't social extinction. It is just a pivot point.
Look, teaching children that failure is data sounds wonderful in like a sociology seminar. But what happens when those children enter the real world? When they enter a global economy that punishes failure with financial ruin? Or a political system that actively rewards performative dominance with absolute power? The system overrides the education instantly.
So, what you're saying, the vulnerability is totally incurable?
I am saying technical and educational tweaks are insufficient unless there is a foundational cultural shift. We have to completely redefine what winning actually means.
From dominance to adaptation?
Exactly. Winning must shift from meaning dominance and absolute certainty to meaning adaptation, intellectual humility, and truth alignment. And that is a massive philosophical leap. And AI cannot make that leap for us.
It can show us the data, though.
It can process all the satellite imagery in the world, but it cannot instill the philosophical value of humility into a species wired to worship status. For university students studying international relations and global ethics, this is the crux of the issue. You cannot code wisdom into an algorithm and hope it fixes human nature.
But how do you instigate a cultural shift of that magnitude without objective tools to point out the flaws in the current system?
I'm not sure we can.
Right, which is why the reality mirror isn't just a diagnostic tool for the leader, it is a mirror for the population too. If AI can clearly demonstrate with empirical evidence across multiple domains that a leader's performative dominance is actually destroying the nation's wealth and security, it provides the necessary friction to spark that cultural shift. It takes the abstract concept of cognitive dissonance and makes its tangible cost visible to every voter and historian.
That only works if the population values empirical evidence over the emotional comfort of the strongman narrative. And history tells us they rarely do. Cognitive dissonance isn't just a leadership problem, it's a societal one.
It's a shared delusion.
Exactly. When the truth of systemic failure collides with a population's national identity, the collective mind often rewrites reality too. People will actively reject the AI's data if it threatens their worldview. AI just cannot force humans to value the truth.
Well, which brings into sharp focus the sheer depth of the challenge we face. We are both looking at the exact same evolutionary mismatch, primitive status protection psychology operating modern, civilization-ending tools.
A terrifying combination.
Truly. But my position remains that the critical triggering vulnerability is the individual leader's ego rigidity, their literal inability to process loss without tearing down the world around them. And because of the scale of modern destruction, AI acting as an integrated reality mirror provides an unprecedented, objective mechanism to measure this rigidity before a leader reaches that catastrophic psychological breakpoint.
And my position holds that focusing on the leader lets the system completely off the hook. The danger is fundamentally structural. Our institutions, our voters, and our markets actively reward performative greatness. Inserting AI into those existing power dynamics doesn't neutralize the threat. It risks co-optation. In a system that punishes truth, AI will just be weaponized to reinforce dangerous delusions.
We clearly have continued tension over whether AI can truly remain objective and enforce constraints, or if systemic rewards for fragile egos will inevitably corrupt the technology. But I think we absolutely converge on the idea that history is not a static timeline of isolated events.
Exactly. It is a recursive loop of human psychology under pressure. Understanding the distinction between dominance and adaptation isn't just some academic exercise.
No, it's essential.
It is vital for historians analyzing failed empires, and it is vital for anyone assessing the stability of modern political leadership across different cultural contexts. The patterns of the past really are the predictors of our future.
There's definitely much more to explore in the source material regarding the intersections of artificial intelligence, historical collapse, and behavioral psychology. And as we continue to build systems capable of global destruction, figuring out how to navigate that intersection is paramount.
Because until we do, we are basically trusting the survival of our civilization to the fragile egos of people terrified of being called a loser.
A very sobering thought. We can mathematically measure the load-bearing capacity of the steel on a bridge. But measuring the ego rigidity of the person deciding whether to cross it or blow it up, well, that is the ultimate test of our civilization's structural integrity.
The future is here. AI Podcast at DigitView.
This is DigitView.